Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who are not present in the courtroom today, I want to take a minute to summarize the nature of the proceedings at our status conference on People versus Christopher Watts this afternoon. Mr. Watts entered a plea of guilty to all 9 counts in the original complaint and information. Those counts include murder in the first degree after deliberation as to Shanann Watts, murder in the first degree as to Bella Watts, murder in the first degree as to Celeste Watts, unlawful termination of a pregnancy as it relates to Nico Watts, and 3 counts of unlawful tampering with a deceased human body. There was a sentencing agreement that calls for the defendant to be sentenced to the Department of Corrections for the remainder of his natural life as to counts 1, 2, and 3. All of those sentences will run consecutively to one another. There's also an agreement that whatever sentence the court imposes as to count 6 will also run consecutively to counts 1 through 3. The remainder of the sentencing will be left to the discretion of the court. That sentencing will occur November 19th at 10 o'clock in the morning. The final piece of the sentencing agreement calls for the district attorney's office, myself, to agree that as a result of his plea of guilty, that he will not face the death penalty. I know that there are going to be a lot of questions about that, so let me address that right up front. Present here in the room with us today is Frank Rusick, Sandra Rusick, and Frank Rusick Jr., Shanann's brother, mom and dad. Mr. Wren and I flew out to North Carolina about 3 weeks ago and spent quite a bit of time with the Rusick family talking about the state of the death penalty in Colorado, the realities of the death penalty. We explained to them the extraordinary delays that currently exist in the state of Colorado as the result of, in part, the actions of our current governor. We discussed the fact that an individual by the name of Nathan Dunlap was convicted and sentenced to death in 1996 and is still alive today. We discussed all of the possible consequences, delays, penalties, timeframes, and I hope I'm saying this accurately. I know they'll correct me if I am wrong, but they were very strongly in favor of a resolution in this case short of the death penalty. That, to me, was the most important consideration in deciding how to proceed with this case. However, as they know, after we had those meetings at their home in North Carolina, I came back and had meetings with all of the law enforcement partners you see standing up here today, with the supervisors in my office, in consultation with other district attorneys around the state, and to a person, the advice and suggestions that I was given was, you do what the victim's family wants you to do in this case. I don't know how I could have sat in Sandy's kitchen and asked her to commit the next 25 years of her life to the criminal justice system without any assurances that that sentence, if ever imposed, or excuse me, if ever obtained, would ever actually be imposed. I want to take an opportunity to thank the law enforcement partners who are standing up here and those who are not up here. This investigation, this prosecution, was exactly what local, state, and federal cooperation should look like. The Frederick Police Department, the Greeley Police Department, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, all worked in conjunction, with one another to present to our office a case that could give this resolution and hopefully this closure to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico's family. Understand that this is not over. As I said, we have a sentencing hearing in a couple of weeks. I'm going to give Director John Camper from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation an opportunity to say a few words here in a couple of minutes. But understand that at this point, I still can't answer questions about the facts surrounding the investigation because at least at this point, the judge has not formally accepted those guilty pleas and imposed sentence. After that sentencing hearing, we will have an opportunity to answer the questions that I know many in the media, many in the public have had from the day this investigation started. But before we answer any questions, I want to invite up Director John Camper.
Welcome to Dark Matters, True Crime, the channel where every case drags you deeper into the unknown. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore the darkest corners of the human mind.
7 years into his sentence at Dodge Correctional, Chris Watts began scratching out a letter he never intended anyone to see. Not the guards, not his parents, Not even the investigators who still hovered around his case like moths circling a dim and flickering bulb. The letter started with a sentence that seemed carved out of bone. "I want the truth DA Michael Rourke hid at my sentencing trial." He stared at the words, as if they could pull him through the concrete walls surrounding his life. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, giving the entire room that ghost-colored tint, like a memory frozen in cheap refrigeration. Chris had spent years convincing himself there were missing pieces. Details the district attorney never revealed, angles that never saw the courtroom, and conversations sealed away in the quiet corners of plea deals and negotiation rooms. He claimed those moments, erased from public view, held the real version of the story, not the one broadcast across the world. But this letter wasn't written to argue innocence. That time had passed. This was something else, a confession of a different kind. A catalog of doubts. A pointing finger at shadows he believed were deliberately left unexamined. He wrote about the morning of his sentencing, the feeling of walking into a room where every face already knew the ending. He described how Rourke stared at him during the victim impact statements, never breaking eye contact, as if daring Chris to interrupt the narrative being laid out before him. Chris didn't. He never had. And now, years later, the silence gnawed at him stronger than any cell door. He folded the letter, tucked it into his Bible, and whispered into the stale prison air. Maybe the truth was never meant to be told, but somebody will hear it one day. And if you want more deep dive storytelling like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Dark Matters True Crime. Chris had replayed the sentencing hearing in his mind so many times that the room had become a permanent fixture in his imagination. The polished wood, the rigid silence, the press cameras blinking like mechanical insects. But there was something else he remembered too, something that most people never noticed. Folder. A thick, dark blue folder placed beside DA Michael Rourke's left hand. Chris had seen it only once, for a fraction of a second, but it burned itself into his memory with the weight of an omen. He remembered the way Rourke rested his fingertips on it whenever the defense spoke, almost as if guarding something inside. Something that wasn't included in the public file. Something Chris had never been allowed to read.
Fully describe the unimaginable tragedy that brings us before this court today. By my comments, I'm not even going to try to express the horror, the pain, or the suffering that the defendant has caused to these families, to this community, and to all who were a part of this investigation. However, I do want to spend a few minutes sharing with the court the details of the crime, as so far you've only had an opportunity to review the affidavit and a few facts here and there that have been offered to the court in the motions and pleadings that have been filed. The questions that have screamed out to anyone who will listen since August 13th of 2018 are why and how. Why did this have to happen? How could a seemingly normal husband and father annihilate his entire family? For what? These are the questions that only one individual in this courtroom or on this planet knows the answers to. I fully expect we will not receive the answers to these questions today, nor will we at any point in the future. I don't expect that he will ever tell the truth about what truly happened or why. Even if he did, there is no rational way that any human being could find those answers acceptable responses to such horrific questions. The best we can do is try to piece together some kind of understanding from the evidence that is available to us. And the evidence tells us this. The defendant coldly and deliberately ended 4 lives. Not in a fit of rage, not by way of accident, but in a calculated and sickening manner. Shanann was 34 years old. She had married the defendant in November of 2012. Over the weekend leading up to August 13th, she had been at a work conference in Phoenix, Arizona, and returned home in the early morning hours of August 13th. We know that she got home about 1:45 in the morning. The doorbell camera on their home shows her arriving back home from the airport. Shortly thereafter, at least according to the defendant, they had what he referred to as an emotional conversation about the state of their marriage and about what their lives would look like going forward. What was said during that emotional conversation, only he knows. What we do know is that shortly after that, the defendant strangled her to death with his own hands. We know that he slowly took her life the morning of August 13th. We know that this was not done in an uncontrolled, vengeful manner that he tried to describe to agents from CBI and the FBI. If that were the case, you would expect to see vicious, horrible bruising about her neck, shoulders, and face. You would expect to see the hyoid bone in her neck broken. You would expect to see some kind of defensive wounds on his body as she struggled and fought for her own life. None of those are present. The only injuries that were on Shanann's body were one set of finger or bruising, what appeared to be fingernail or finger mark bruising to the right side of her neck. We know that our experts will tell us that it takes 2 to 4 minutes to strangle someone to death manually with their own hands. The horror that she felt as the man that she loved wrapped his hands around her throat and choked the life out of her must have been unimaginable. Even worse, what must Bella, age 4, and Celeste, age 3, must have experienced or thought as their father, the one man on this planet who was supposed to nurture and protect them, was snuffing out their lives. They both died from smothering. Let me say that again. The man seated to my right smothered his daughters. Why? Imagine the horror in Bella's mind as her father took her last breaths away. Your Honor, understand very clearly, Bella fought back for her life. The frenulum, the connective tissue between her upper lip and her gum, had a centimeter and a half laceration. She bit her tongue multiple times before she died. She fought back for her life as her father smothered her. Celeste had no such injuries. In fact, she had no external injuries at all. But according to the medical examiner, she was smothered nonetheless. The defendant then methodically and calmly loaded their bodies into his work truck, not in a hasty or disorganized way. He was seen from the neighbor's doorbell camera backing his truck into the driveway, going back and forth into the house and back out to the truck 3 different times.
Over the years, he convinced himself that folder held the unanswered questions that still haunted him. Reports that never went to trial. Interviews sealed under confidentiality. Digital forensics that the DA chose not to pursue after the plea deal. He remembered the investigator who whispered to Rourke during a recess. The 2 men leaned in, their conversation nearly silent. But Chris remembered the moment Rourke's eyes shifted toward him. Not with anger, but with calculation. Like someone holding a key no one else knew existed. What was in that folder? Chris muttered to himself now, staring at the cold cement floor of his cell. Why hide anything? Unless it mattered? He wondered if it contained the pieces of his life the prosecution didn't need to expose because the plea deal cut the case short. Or perhaps it held details that didn't fit the narrative they wanted the world to believe. Either way, Chris believed the truth wasn't fully told that day. Not by him and not by the DA. And if you're captivated by these deeper layers of the case, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Dark Matters True Crime for more. Chris remembered the moment DA Michael Rourke stood inches from him. Close enough that Chris could hear the faint crackle of the courtroom microphones. Everyone else saw a prosecutor delivering a final message to a convicted man. But Chris remembered something different. He remembered the pause. Rourke had been reading from his notes, hammering every detail of Shanann's last moments, every justification for the life sentence he demanded. But then suddenly he stopped. He closed the file, lifted his eyes, and looked directly at Chris. Not with rage, not with grief, with something else. Something Chris still couldn't name. I hope, Rourke said slowly, that someday, the full truth comes out. It was a strange statement, out of place, unnecessary, and spoken in a tone that didn't match the rest of his speech. And then Rourke moved on, as if he hadn't said anything unusual at all.
Her upper lip and her gum had a centimeter and a half laceration. She bit her tongue multiple times before she died. She fought back for her life as her father smothered her. Celeste had no such injuries. In fact, she had no external injuries at all. But according to the medical examiner, she was smothered nonetheless. The defendant then methodically and calmly loaded their bodies into his work truck, not in a hasty or disorganized way. He was seen from the neighbor's doorbell camera backing his truck into the driveway, going back and forth into the house and back out to the truck 3 different times, 1 time for each of their bodies. He then drove them away from their family home 1 final time, intent on hiding any evidence of the crimes that he had just committed. In one final sign of callousness for his wife, his daughters, and their unborn son, and their remains, he drove them to a location that he thought no one would ever find them, to one of the oil tank batteries with which he was so familiar. He knew this was safe. He had texted a coworker the night before saying, "I'll head out to that site. I'll take care of it." He had carefully ensured that he would be alone in the middle of the plains to secrete away the remains of his family in a place that he hoped they would never be found. In one final measure of disrespect for the family he once had, he ensured that they would not be together, even in death, or so he thought. He disposed of them in different locations. He buried Shanann and Nico in a shallow grave away from the oil tanks. Bella and Celeste were thrown away in the oil tanks at this facility. Different tanks, so these little girls wouldn't be together in death. Imagine this, Your Honor. This defendant took those little girls and put them through a hatch at the top of an oil tank, 8 inches in diameter. Bella had scratches on her left buttocks from being shoved through this hole. A tuft of blonde hair was found on the edge of one of these hatches. The defendant told investigators that Bella's tank seemed emptier than CC's because of the sound that the splashes made. These were his daughters. Significantly, when his coworkers arrived at the tank battery later that morning, to a person, they all described him as acting completely normally. It was a normal workday, even while his daughters sank in the oil and water not far away from him. And then his efforts at deception truly began. We've all seen the emotionless interviews that the defendant gives to the local media, asking for help in locating his family. We watched as he claimed that the house was empty without them, and that he hoped that they were somewhere safe, and that he just wanted them to come home. He told investigators that they were at home sleeping when he left for work that morning, and that Shanann had told him that she was taking the girls to a friend's house for the day. What is striking about this case, Your Honor, beyond the horrors that I've already described to you, is the number of collateral victims that he created by his actions. While he stood in front of TV cameras asking for the safe return of his family, scores of law enforcement officers, neighbors, friends, and family scoured the area, fretted for their safe return. They texted him begging for any information and sending him their best wishes, all the while he hid what he had done. The list of indirect victims does not end there. Think of the firefighters and the Colorado State Patrol hazmat experts who had to don protective suits and who were called upon to pull Bella and Celeste out of those oil tanks. Or the coroner employees who had to conduct these autopsies. Or the victim assistants who frantically attempted to ease the suffering of those affected. All of this, Your Honor, for what? Why? Why did this have to happen? His motive was simple, Your Honor. He had a desire for a fresh start, to begin a relationship with a new love that overpowered all decency and feelings for his wife, his daughters, and unborn son. While Shanann texted the defendant over and over again in the days and weeks leading up to her death, attempting to save her marriage, The defendant secreted pictures of his girlfriend into his phone and searched and texted her at all hours of the night. While Shanann sent the defendant self-help and relationship counseling books, one of which, ironically enough, was thrown in the garbage, he was searching the internet for secluded vacation spots to take his new love in researching jewelry.
Chris replayed that moment for 7 years. Did Rourke know something he wasn't allowed to bring up in court? Something he couldn't introduce because Chris had already pled guilty? Something the public wasn't supposed to hear? That pause haunted him more than the sentence itself. Back in his cell, Chris whispered the line again. The full truth. Was the DA talking about the digital data investigators collected but never disclosed? The interviews with people close to Chris that never became public record? The inconsistencies in timelines that were quietly boxed away? Or was it something even darker? Something neither of them had spoken aloud? Chris had carried the weight of that stare for years, and now, for the first time, he felt ready to challenge the narrative that had defined his entire existence behind bars. If you're following this unraveling timeline, remember to like the video and subscribe to Dark Matters True Crime for more deep dive revelations. Chris said the moment that finally broke him didn't happen in the courtroom. It happened months later during a routine prison review. A guard handed him a copy of his case inventory, a list of every piece of evidence officially logged. Chris didn't expect to see anything unusual. After all, according to the DA, every relevant item had already been presented in court. But something was unusual. Halfway down the page was a line item he had never heard before. Supplemental storage, digital package C. No description, no details, just a label, followed by a blank space where evidence notes should have been. Chris asked the guard what digital package C meant. The guard shrugged and said it was probably sealed or restricted. Sometimes the DA keeps stuff locked down, he said casually. Happens with high-profile cases. But Chris couldn't let it go. He remembered investigators copying his phone, Shanann's phone, the girls' tablets, and his truck data. But 3 separate digital packages? He'd only ever known about 2, the ones turned over to his defense before the plea. So what was package C? And why was it marked supplemental? Meaning it came after the initial collection. That night, Chris stared at his cell ceiling, tracing the invisible puzzle pieces. A DA who said the full truth wasn't out, evidence he wasn't allowed to see, and a mysterious third digital archive that had never been mentioned in interviews, documentaries, or reports. If this box held something that complicated the official timeline, something that contradicted his plea, something that pointed beyond him, then reopening the case wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Chris said the truth didn't fully hit him until he received a routine packet of his prison records. A printout of every visitor request, every approved contact, every rejection, every flagged communication. He flipped through the pages lazily at first, expecting nothing but the usual. His mother's declined requests, his father's occasional letters, a handful of distant relatives he barely remembered. Then he saw it. A line stamped in red. External inquiry, federal liaison. Date. Sealed. Chris froze. He had never been contacted by any federal department. He'd never spoken to anyone outside the state investigators and the DA's office, at least not officially. But this entry wasn't an error. There were codes attached to it, a reference number, and worst of all, outcome. No contact, restricted by DA, restricted by the district attorney. That made no sense. If a federal agency tried to contact an inmate, state authorities normally allowed it, especially in a homicide case. There was no legal reason to block it unless the inquiry threatened the official narrative. Chris pressed his hand against the cold metal table in the review room as the thought unfurled inside him like a slow-burning fuse. Were they trying to speak with him about something that hadn't been included in the state's case? Something connected to the sealed digital evidence? Something the DA didn't want reopened? Why would a federal liaison, the type involved in interstate or multi-agency issues, attempt to visit him when the case was supposedly straightforward and closed forever? Unless someone had raised alarms. Unless someone had presented information the state didn't want exposed. Unless someone else had been involved. Chris leaned back, his voice low as he told it. The moment I saw that restricted contact, I knew it. The truth isn't buried. It's locked up, and someone is terrified of the key. If you want the next chapter of this investigation, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Dark Matters True Crime. Chris said there was one moment, one he still thinks about at night, that convinced him something in his case was being filtered, edited, or quietly buried. It started with a guard handing him a small stack of mail, rubber-banded together, the way they always delivered it. Junk pamphlets, a Bible verse card from an anonymous church group, a short note from a cousin he barely remembered, and then nothing else. But when he flipped to the back of the stack, he noticed the envelope count was off. He always received at least 5 letters a week from random supporters, critics, or curious strangers. It was never consistent, but never this light. He asked the guard casually, "Is that everything?" The guard shrugged. "Everything that cleared." That word again. Cleared. Chris said he didn't think much of it until 2 days later, when another inmate, a man he barely talked to, slipped him a warning during lunch. "Check your mail log. They're holding things back from you." Chris didn't believe him at first, but the inmate shook his head, eyes wide, voice sharp with certainty. Not just fan mail. Important stuff. Legal stuff. Later that night, Chris requested his mail record, a handwritten log with timestamps, senders, and reasons for withholding. He expected maybe 1 or 2 withheld items. He found 14. 14 letters marked held, investigative relevance, flagged, external legal inquiry, returned, restricted subject, and 1 entry, one that made his blood run cold, confidential notice, forwarded to DA's office. He stared at that line for a long time. No sender listed, no return address, no written reason, just a quiet note that something meant for him never made it to his hands. It vanished upward. Into the same office he now accused of hiding key evidence during his sentencing. That night, lying on his thin mattress, Chris said he realized something unsettling. Somebody out there was trying to get information to him. Something important enough to trigger a chain reaction of censorship, and someone else didn't want him to read it. Not the prison, not a random warden, but the DA's office itself. Chris whispered in the interview room, "That letter, whoever sent it, they knew something about what really happened, and the DA made sure it never reached me." Whether this was paranoia or a glimpse into a much darker oversight, no one knows yet. But Chris believes that letter might have been the biggest truth of all, the piece that could tear open the seams of his entire case. Chris said the moment everything shifted, the moment he realized the truth he wanted exposed wasn't just about him, but about the entire structure around his case, came from a single name, or rather, a name that shouldn't have existed. It happened during a routine review of his legal materials. Every inmate has access to their court documents, transcripts, and evidence lists. Chris had gone through his hundreds of pages countless times, mostly out of boredom, sometimes out of guilt. But recently, after learning someone was blocking mail and censoring outside contact, he'd started reading every line differently, looking not for what was there, but what was missing. Then he noticed it, buried in a chain of discovery notes, squeezed between timestamps and digital evidence codes, was a reference to a person he had never once heard mentioned before. Consultation, K. Madsen, external analyst, case integrity review. Chris said his heart almost stopped. He flipped every page, checking again and again. That name, K. Madsen, didn't appear in any interview records. Not in the official investigative timeline. Not in the DA's public briefings. Not in media reports. Nowhere. One appearance. One line. One ghost. And according to the document, this person reviewed case integrity before sentencing. Yet the state never acknowledged them, nor listed the results of their review. Chris told the interviewer, if they were checking case integrity, then something was wrong with the case to begin with. That's the only reason someone like that gets involved. Who was this person? What did they review? Why was their involvement hidden? The strangest part came next. Contacting or identifying this type of analyst should have been simple. Records should exist. Case consultants aren't classified. They appear in logs, legal notes, attorney briefs. But when Chris asked his prison caseworker to help locate information on the name, she returned 3 days later looking uneasy. She told him, "There's no record of any external analyst with that name ever assigned to your case. Not in the public system. Not in sealed files. It's like they don't exist." But the name was right there in his documents. Handwritten, dated, certified. Chris said he stared at it, a single phrase looping through his mind. If they erased the person, they erased what the person found. He started to believe the missing analyst wasn't an error, but evidence of something intentionally removed from the official narrative. Something someone didn't want the world or a jury to ever see. A piece of truth with a name attached. A truth that vanished. Chris said the final realization didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It came slowly, a creeping certainty, like a shadow sliding across the floor until it touched his feet. He believed the DA didn't just hide contact attempts, didn't just erase an analyst's identity, didn't just silence outside inquiries. He believed the DA hid the part of the case that didn't fit the lone monster narrative. In the final interview, Chris sat stiffly, hands pressed together, eyes glassy with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. His voice was steady, but it carried the brittle edge of someone who's held onto a secret so long it began to rot inside him. He said the truth he wanted exposed was this. There were digital footprints, searches, coordinates, message fragments that he swears did not come from him. Some linked to locations he hadn't visited. Some tied to devices he didn't use. Some were time-stamped when he was on camera doing something else entirely. And yet, none of it appeared in the DA's sentencing presentation. None of it appeared in court filings. None of it made it into the narrative that the public consumed. Chris said when he asked why those anomalies weren't investigated, he was told, "It doesn't change your guilt." Maybe he was guilty. He never denied that part. But he insisted that the full story, the details surrounding the planning, the digital traces, the external involvement, was sealed away because acknowledging it would complicate a case the DA wanted closed neatly and permanently. Closed before questions could grow teeth. Closed before outside agencies could dig. Closed before anyone could say, someone else knew something. In the final minutes of his interview, Chris said, "I don't want out. I don't want pity. I want the truth the DA buried to see sunlight. Because whatever they hid, it's bigger than me. And if people ever see it, this whole case will explode open." The camera recording him clicked off. The interview ended. But his claim, true or not, left a tremor in the air. A warning he seemed desperate to pass on. A truth sealed in a room we're not allowed to open. A truth someone fought to bury. A truth he insists will come out whether the system wants it to or not. If you want more deep investigations into the Watts case and others like it, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Dark Matters True Crime.
Thanks, Mr. Rourke. I think it goes without saying when something so horrible happens, it's really not possible to be particularly celebratory. But that said, I think all of us are gratified at the outcome here, primarily for Shanann's family, but also the many investigators and other professionals, as Mr. Rourke said, some who are represented here and many who are not, who have devoted so much time, energy, and frankly emotion into this tragic case. Really all everyone wanted throughout was justice for Shanann and Bella and Celeste, and we're certainly pleased that this seems to be the outcome. So on behalf of the CBI and I think the other organizations and many who were involved in this, our deepest condolences to the Ruzicks and their family and friends. Thank you.
I'll be happy to answer questions, but I will be the first to tell you that I truly appreciate the Ruzicks being present, not only in the state of Colorado, but in this room. I can tell you on behalf of them, they are not prepared, nor do they want to answer questions at this point, and I hope you all will respect that. I will try to answer questions as best I can on their behalf, at least today. So what questions can I answer for you all?
Could the death penalty ever be imposed in a state of California?
I don't know. We have a governor in office right now who, understandably, we have an election going on today. He is term limited. We have a governor who has refused to make a decision as it relates to Nathan Dunlap. I explained that to the Rusick family, and obviously that gives them some pause when I'm asking them to endure a 4 or 5 year delay prior to a trial, and many more years after that of appeals and post-conviction hearings before that sentence could ever possibly be imposed. So when the question was asked of me by their family, what is the realistic outcome of this particular case as it relates to the death penalty, the best I could tell them is I don't know.
You said that they requested that you not seek the death penalty. How did that affect your process?
I went through the same process I would have had their answer been different. I had in my mind from the day this occurred, the steps in the process that I felt like were due diligence in order to come to this decision. I don't think any elected district attorney ever wants to have to make a decision about whether or not to seek the death penalty as it relates to an individual. But when I have a family who has been so incredibly supportive and so incredibly firm in their belief that the death penalty not be sought, I don't know how I would have said to them, I'm going to do it anyway.
How early into the process was that decision made?
The decision was made about 4 days ago.
How was the family and how did the family react when you told them about this decision?
I think there were a lot of emotions that went through their mind, and again, they're going to throw something at me if I say something inappropriate. I think that there was a combination of relief, extraordinary sadness that we ever had to have that conversation in the first place. And I can only say that I hope there is a sense of closure. I know that that will never be fully realized because obviously the tragedy that sits before us today is the loss of 4 beautiful lives. And no matter what happens today, no matter what happens at a sentencing hearing down the road, we can't get them back. Sandy said it very, very poignantly to me. She said, he made the choice to take those lives. I do not want to be in a position of making the choice to take his. And so that's about as firmly as she could have said it to me, and that was very compelling to all of us as we were talking about how to proceed on this case.
Chris Watts first said Shanann actually killed the 2 little girls. What was his story when he changed his mind? And were they killed before Shanann got home?
Carol, I don't know the answer to that question. We talked a lot about whether we would require him to come forward and give us what we believe to be a complete, accurate, and truthful statement. I think all of those who were involved never truly believed that he would give us an accurate statement. What I can tell you most affirmatively today by what happened in the courtroom is the spotlight that he tried to shine on Shanann falsely, incorrectly, and frankly a flat-out lie has been corrected. The spotlight shines directly where it belongs, on him.
What's the status of the autopsy?
Those are still sealed at this point. I need to have a conversation with the coroner's office, with Shanann's family, and the county attorney representing the coroner's office about at what point in time those will become a public record. We are not assuming that the sentencing hearing goes the way we believe that it will and goes forward. We will not be asking those be kept sealed any longer after the sentencing hearing.
When did discussions with the defense begin about the plea deal?
Several weeks ago. I can't tell you the exact date, but it's been several weeks in the making. We had very preliminary discussions prior to visiting the Rusicks in North Carolina.
Was it just a matter of the death penalty to get a guilty plea?
You'd have to ask them. All I can tell you is the discussions that we had with them, and frankly the discussions that Mr. Wren and I had with the Rusick family made it very clear that there was going to be no further concession. I didn't feel like this was a case where it was appropriate to agree to dismiss some counts in exchange for a plea of guilty to others, because we charged him with what we truly believed he had done at the time we filed that complaint. And I was not willing to entertain any further concessions above and beyond removing the death penalty from consideration.
During your investigation, did you ever get a motive from Chris Watts?
Ask me again in 2.5 weeks, or the day after the day of sentencing. I'll be happy to answer that question. At this point, that's getting a little bit too far into the investigation, at least as we sit right now. We believe that we have a partial motive. I'm not sure if it's the entirety of the motive, but I'll be happy to comment on that following a sentencing hearing.
Will Christopher Watts be solitary confinement?
You know, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Whether or not he's in solitary confinement where he serves his time, whether it be in what DOC facility in the state of Colorado, or if he's one who's transferred to another state, is left to the discretion of the executive director of the Department of Corrections. I don't
The
know.
plea agreement also required those consecutive
Yes.
sentences. Can you talk about the importance of that?
Sure.
To yourself, to law enforcement, and to the prisoners?
Absolutely. I think that the plea of guilty to each of those counts, naming those individual victims, Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, was an important consideration, but also he deserves a life sentence for each and every act on top of one another. In practicality, it doesn't make a difference in terms of how long he's ultimately going to serve. But what he needs to understand is he will be serving 3 consecutive life sentences plus a sentence for Nico Watts because of the acts that he committed against all 4 of them. It was important that each of those beautiful human beings